Hello, and welcome to the Pioneer Valley Symphony's 83rd season. I am David Schneider, Professor of Music History and European Studies at Amherst College, and the resident musicologist of the Pioneer Valley Symphony. I'm delighted to be sharing some thoughts related to this evening's program with you today. I'd like to begin, however, by saying that we all wish that this season could have us in person with you tonight, and we remain hopeful that this may be possible in the spring. For the time being, however, we are delighted that the members of the orchestra have once again been able to gather together for rehearsals. With tonight's broadcast, we are sharing with you the fruits of their labor and their love of playing. This evening, the Pioneer Valley Symphony is playing two so-called war horses of the 19th century orchestral repertoire. Liszt's symphonic poem, Les Préludes of 1856, and Dvořák's Symphony No. 9 in E minor, the so-called New World Symphony of 1893. Since I have used the term war horse in describing the works on this program, I thought I should take a moment to reflect on this designation with you. The term war horse originally refers to, and here I'm quoting a dictionary definition, a large, powerful horse of great stamina ridden in battle. The term has also come to mean a politician of long service who has survived many political battles, but applied to musical works, the term can sometimes have a pejorative tone, as in, why in the world do they keep on trotting out the same old war horses instead of playing something new? Tonight, I would like to reclaim for Les Préludes and the New World Symphony the positive implications of the term. In my opinion, these two works are war horses in the best sense of the word. They have stood the test of time because they are unusually strong and emotionally rich, which is to say that they communicate to us and they continue to hold our interest despite the changes in artistic fashion since the time of their composition. For a work to communicate implies that it holds meaning. And one of the preoccupations of 19th century composers of orchestral music was making their works maximally meaningful. This objective was inspired by the notion held by early 19th century critics such as E.T.A. Hoffmann that instrumental music, which does not have sung words to communicate a concrete meaning, is actually more meaningful than songs or opera, which clearly carry the meaning associated with the sung text. Instrumental music, E.T.A. Hoffmann and others argued, could be infinitely meaningful because, since it held no one specific meaning, it could be interpreted in an infinite variety of ways. It is no coincidence that this new way of understanding instrumental music was being developed in tandem with Beethoven's composition of his symphonies. To put this another way, the instrumental works that inspired this change in thinking were symphonies of unprecedented rhetorical force. Yet, as the famous addition of a chorus singing Schiller's Ode to Joy in the last movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony demonstrates, composers still found themselves drawn to texts because of the immediacy of words in conveying meaning. In other words, composers liked the indeterminacy of the meaning, but they also craved the intensity of the meaning that came with words. The logical result of these two methods of conveying meaning, one with, one without words, was that composers tried to combine them, associating a purely instrumental work with a written text that would help orient the listener in the direction of the meaning the composer had in mind without being too specific. The way I think of this is that composers attempted to supersaturate their works with meaning by having their cake and eating it too. That is, by taking advantage of using both the concreteness of a written text and the interpretative richness inherent in the indeterminate nature of instrumental music. Franz Liszt was a leader in the movement to make instrumental music maximally meaningful. And he came up with the term symphonic poem to describe his works with this new approach of using text in conjunction with a purely instrumental piece. It is important to emphasize here that he wanted the performers and audience to know about this text, and to that end, he generally printed it in the score and in the concert program. And later on in my talk, you'll see why I'm emphasizing that Liszt wanted the audience members to know about this written text or program. For the symphonic poem on tonight's concert, Liszt claimed that the work was inspired by Les Préludes, so that's where it gets its name, from a 370-line poem by the French poet Alphonse Lamartine. Since the length of the poem was much too long for a concert program, 375 lines, a synopsis of the poem, supposedly by Liszt, but in fact written by his romantic partner, a woman by the name of Caroline Sane Wittgenstein, was given instead. And I've given this synopsis of Lamartine's Les Préludes in the program note, so you can read it in its entirety. It's not very long, about 100 words or so. Now, the sequence of topics in this synopsis corresponds to Liszt's composition amazingly well, and I might even say suspiciously well. And let me give you an example of what I mean. The text begins with a question. What else is our life but a series of preludes to that unknown hymn, the first and solemn note of which is intoned by death? So that's a pretty weighty kind of a question. And Liszt depicts it musically with a questioning, what I'll call a questioning motive, and an introduction that features this motive in kind of tentative, questioning ways. And if you'll excuse my singing, I'll try to approximate the sound of that motive for you. Da, da, da. So that 3 notes. Da, da, da. Not only does this questioning motive and the introductory section that Liszt composes out of it refer to Caroline Sane Wittgenstein's text, it also refers to a piece of Beethoven's, a late string quartet that contains a similar 3-note motive, under which Beethoven wrote, Muss es sein? Which means, must it be? This intertextual reference provides yet another layer of meaning, another layer of what I would call supersaturation of meaning to Liszt's music. I want to give you one more example here. Caroline Sane Wittgenstein's text goes on with this little phrase, love is the glowing dawn of all existence. And musically, I would say this corresponds to what I would call a love theme. And this love theme, I want you to note, is begun with that same similar motive. So I'm going to sing now what is the love theme, and I'll point out that similarity in the opening. Dum da dee da dee hum ba dee dee. So it goes on in a way that, makes it seem like a love theme. So again, we're relating it to the text. And one can find this kind of correspondence between the text and the music all the way through. There is, however, one small problem, and really this problem may be completely small. In other words, it may be just a problem that musicologists see. But musicological research has shown that Liszt wrote almost all of the music to Les Préludes prior to associating it with Lamartine's poem. He didn't even put the name on it until very late, until he had composed almost all of the music and unearthed Lamartine's poem and then decided, oh, that's a good title of my work, or for my work. Furthermore, Caroline Sane Wittgenstein's text bears only a loose relationship to Lamartine's poem, which has led some musicologists, including myself, to believe that she wrote it to fit the sequence of sections in Liszt's work. She made it seem as if it was expressing Liszt's work by fitting it to it, rather than Liszt writing the music in response to the text, which is what he claimed. So I guess that's the problem, if there is one, that Liszt seems to have claimed one thing and really done another. But my own feeling is that it does not particularly matter which came first, the written text or the music. What matters most is that Liszt felt that audiences would be helped by having some concrete images to associate with the various moods of the different sections of his work, and he thought that relationship, the text together with the music, would make it most semantically, most meaningfully rich. I'd now like to turn our attention to a different type of relationship to text in Dvořák's New World Symphony. Dvořák wrote the New World Symphony while living in New York, where he had come to direct the relatively new National Conservatory of Music. Before getting to the United States, more or less the only thing that Dvořák knew about the indigenous population of the country was what he had read in a Czech translation of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's epic poem, The Song of Hiawatha. This was a highly romanticized depiction of Native American life that has long since fallen out of favor. Nonetheless, Dvořák was fascinated with the story and contemplated writing an opera on it. Only once in passing did he say that it served as an inspiration for his New World Symphony, and then the only thing he said is that the third movement was a depiction of an Indian dance at the Feast of Hiawatha. Recently, however, a good friend of mine, the musicologist Michael Beckerman, has presented evidence that the second movement may also bear a relationship to the poem. Beckerman sees the first section of the slow movement as a reflection of the landscape depicted during Hiawatha's homeward journey in the 10th chapter of the epic. And here are a couple of lines that describe this. Pleasant was the journey homeward through interminable forests, over meadow, over mountain. So the music that Beckerman associates with this section of the poem is this most famous part of the symphony. And this theme is played by the English horn in the second movement. And I'll do my rendition of it for you. Da dee dee da dee dee da da dee da 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 dee da 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 dee dee da. Now, interestingly, this melody was thought to sound very much like an African-American spiritual. And there's some evidence, and I've written about this in the program notes, that it was inspired by the singing of one of Dvořák's African-American composition students in the United States. He didn't sing him this exact melody. This melody is made up by Dvořák, but Dvořák, I think, was probably channeling something of the spirit of the spirituals that he had heard this young man, Harry Burley, sing. Later on, though, a good deal later on, over 20 years later, another student of Dvořák's arranged this melody as actually a spiritual. He set spiritual-like words to it and sold it as sheet music. It always said by Dvořák on it, but it was part of the spiritual repertoire. And it had the title Goin' Home. So I'll just, again, do a short rendition of the beginning of it. Goin' home, goin' home, I'm a-goin' home, quiet like some still day, I'm a-goin' home. Now, I find this text quite interesting because this home referred to in the spiritual, I would take to be what is commonly done in spirituals, which is this is a kind of a final going home. This is going home to a resting place. This is going home to God's heaven. This is dying, is really what this going home is about. And yet, in the Longfellow poem, there's this sense of a homeward journey that Beckermann has now associated with this section. So it makes me wonder, and I don't believe that we have any evidence about that, but it makes me wonder if Dvořák's student who set these words may have actually been aware that there was a relationship to this homeward journey from Hiawatha with this melody. Now, in the next part of the slow movement, there's a contrasting section. It goes like this. So much darker, contrasting section. And that Beckermann hears as inspired by a part of the poem that describes the forest funeral of Hiawatha's bride, Minnehaha. And that comes at the end of chapter 20. As I say, this is a very, very long poem. And then, finally, Beckermann claims that the next section of the movement, with its bird calls, represents the last 30 lines of the chapter. And here's an excerpt from the poem. All the birds sang loud and sweetly, songs of happiness and heart's ease. And I can't really sing this section, but I'll try to give you a sense of it. So very light in the flute and oboe. Flute and oboe have very, very important parts in this symphony. So I'm fascinated by Beckermann's argument, and I find it convincing. What I would like to emphasize for you today, however, is that it's clear that Dvořák did not want his audience's interpretation of the slow movement to be limited by these images. Had that been his goal, he could have easily written it into the score or described it in the printed program of the work's premiere, the way Liszt did with Les Préludes. For Dvořák, Hiawatha seems to have served as a very important inspiration, but as far as we can tell, it did not constitute the meaning of the work for Dvořák. I think Dvořák wanted to leave that meaning open to what you hear in it, to what I hear in it, to what we all hear in it. So I return again to the argument for so-called absolute music, that is, music without a related text meant to guide us through it. Brahms and Dvořák, and they were good friends, and Brahms really supported Dvořák. So these two great late 19th century composers considered absolute music to be music's highest calling, while Liszt and a collection of his friends and artistic acquaintances, including Hector Berlioz and Wagner and a follower who came later, like Richard Strauss, they advocated for program music, that is, music explicitly tied to a text as the pinnacle of their musical art. And in the 19th century, there were tremendous polemics fighting for one type of musical expression being better than the other. And I think that those arguments seem a little bit quaint to us today. And my own feeling is that what makes so much 19th century music so special is that whatever stories it tells, whether concretized in words or left open to our imaginations, it tells them with a vividness and an emotionality that feels deeply meaningful, whether or not we can put that emotionality into words. And I would argue that it is precisely those works that have come to be known as war horses that actually do this the best. For the last section of my remarks, I'd like to turn what I call in my teaching fun facts, and what you might consider the musicological or historical trivia that in my experience shows ways in which music history overlaps with broader historical themes, or at least it does if you apply a little creativity to them. So today I'd like to do that by telling you a bit more about some of the figures related in various ways to the two pieces on tonight's program. The first person I'd like to tell you a bit more about is Caroline Sane Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein was a Polish princess, and you'll often see her referred to as the Princess Caroline Sane Wittgenstein. She was born to a rich but untitled family, meaning that her family had the wealth but not the official title of nobility. And she became a princess at the age of 17 when she married Prince Nicholas von Sane-Wittgenstein-Berleburg-Ludwigsburg. And I just love that German title so long. And despite the fact that it's a German title, he was an officer in the Russian army. So as these things happen, especially when people get married so young, the marriage turned out to be an unhappy one for Caroline. And following a concert that she attended in Kiev given by Liszt, she and this superstar pianist started a relationship that would last for some 40 years. She and Liszt were both Roman Catholics, and thus they wanted to get married, and they wanted to get married in a Catholic manner. But for that to happen, Caroline's first marriage was going to have to be annulled. So she appealed to the Pope for the annulment, and he agreed. But before the marriage could take place, that is, the marriage between her and Liszt, the Pope ended up rescinding the annulment, which meant that she and Liszt ultimately couldn't be married. And the reason that the Pope rescinded the annulment was because there was an intervention from the Russian Tsar. So this was a big political event, very high level, would have been all over to today's tabloids. But that was it. The Pope didn't grant that annulment. So there was no marriage between St. Wittgenstein and Liszt. And eventually they stopped having a romantic relationship, but they remained very, very, very close to the end of their lives. And St. Wittgenstein died only a few months after Liszt. Now, St. Wittgenstein was very important to Liszt because she was the one who convinced him to stop touring and dedicate his time to composition. Of course, she was also very emotionally important to him. And she was also very important for his reputation because many of his publications were actually authored by her. So most notably among these is Liszt's biography of Chopin, which is really by Caroline Sane Wittgenstein, a very educated woman of letters. The next person I'd like to tell you about is a really amazing woman by the name of Jeanette Myers Thurber. And Thurber lived for almost 100 years, from 1850 to 1946. She was the founder of the National Conservatory of America in 1885, and this was in New York City. And this was the most important conservatory in the United States until about 1920, when the school that would later become Juilliard sort of outpaced it. Thurber was unusual in her day for being a leading philanthropist and for her lack of racial prejudice. So it wasn't so common to have women as big philanthropists, and the lack of racial prejudice among the highly moneyed was also quite unusual. And her conservatory was open to students of all races. Having studied at the Paris Conservatory, Thurber knew a great deal about music, and through her connections in Europe, she realized that Dvořák would be the man that she needed to lead her conservatory on a new path. And that new path was to being the establishment, or being a place for the establishment, of an American National School of Composition. Now, neither she nor Dvořák seem to have thought that he, a Czech composer known for the Czech character of his works, that he personally would create an American style of composition. That wasn't their idea. But they thought that through his training, American students would come to create that national style of music. And they thought that it would come about through them integrating characteristic American style folk music of the United States in their compositions, and their art music compositions, or symphonies, to put it another way. And they thought that then these people, through doing that, would create this American school, this American style of classical composition. Legend has it that Thurber initially had trouble convincing Dvořák to leave his position. Well, we know that she initially had trouble convincing Dvořák to leave his position in Prague. But what we don't quite know for sure is why he decided to change his mind, leave Prague, and come to New York. But the legend part is that Dvořák's wife found out how much he was being offered and convinced him to accept Thurber's offer. So she was offering $15,000 a year. And to put that in perspective, $15,000 a year in 1891 is a bit more than $450,000 today. So that is quite a tidy sum, and it seems to have tipped the balance for Dvořák to come and spend some time in the United States. Thus, it is not only Dvořák, but also Jeanette Thurber we have to thank for some of Dvořák's most important compositions, including not only the New World Symphony, but his last work, the Cello Concerto. Now, the Cello Concerto was written back home in Prague, not in New York the way the New World Symphony was. But the reason that Dvořák felt confident in trying his hand at a cello concerto when he actually originally had not thought that the cello was a good solo instrument, what inspired him was his fellow composer at this National Conservatory, a man named Victor Herbert, who had written a very successful cello concerto, and that's what inspired Dvořák to give writing a cello concerto a try. And now that's the way the New World Symphony is one of the most famous symphonies. Dvořák's cello concerto is the absolute pinnacle of the repertoire for concerto and orchestra. Now, Thurber's conservatory ceased operations shortly after the stock market crash in 1929, and she could no longer afford to pay, the huge subventions needed for it to realize her ideals of being open to students of all backgrounds, independent of their ability to pay. So now we come to Harry Burley. Harry Burley was among the highly successful African-American students at Thurber's conservatory. And he's a singer and a composer we often hear about in connection with the spiritual-like feel of the main theme of the second movement of Dvořák's New World Symphony. Burley attended Thurber's conservatory on a scholarship underwritten by none other than Frances McDowell. So Frances McDowell was the mother of the well-known American composer and pianist Edward McDowell. And Mrs. McDowell, Frances, was not coincidentally also the registrar of the National Conservatory. So we get lots of interconnections here. As a composer, Burley was best known, or perhaps is best known, for his arrangements of spirituals with piano accompaniments. And by putting these piano accompaniments to these traditional songs, it made them suitable for inclusion in song recitals. So in essence, it brought spirituals into the concert hall. His day job, as it were, was as a singer. And he sang as the soloist in New York St. George's Episcopal Church for a very, very long time, for 52 years, retiring from there in 1946. Again, I'm just amazed at how modern some of these people who were connected to Dvořák, became, how long they lived. I want to tell you that when Burley was hired for his position at this church, many parishioners of it, and it was a very elite congregation, were opposed to hiring an African American. And very interestingly to me, it was the banker J.P. Morgan who cast the deciding vote in Burley's favor. Burley was a mentor to the great American contralto, Marian Anderson. They were very close, and she went to him for all kinds of advice about her career and who her accompanist should be, and he, supported her in an amazing way from long before she became super famous. And she became super famous, of course, for the wonderful quality of her voice, but also for some signal moments in the history of the United States. One was forcing the Daughters of the American Revolution to admit blacks into their theater in Washington, D.C. And another was breaking the color barrier at the Metropolitan Opera. And what I find interesting about this sequence from Harry Burley to Marian Anderson is that then Anderson, in turn, served as inspiration for several generations of great Metropolitan Opera stars, such as Leontine Price, who in turn was an inspiration to Jesse Norman. But Jesse Norman was also very much influenced by Marian Anderson directly, and the two of them were actually quite close. And when you take Leontine Price and Jesse Norman and Marian Anderson, you get a whole host of inspirations that have brought us many of the leading opera singers of today, many of whom are African American. And finally, I'd like to mention a generation of African American composers that was not taught directly by Dvořák, but that was inspired by his idea of integrating American folk music. And this folk music was understood by Dvořák and by these African American composers to mean characteristically African American styles of music. And so the integration of these into classical styles of music, piano sonatas, symphonies, concertos, these kinds of things. The three best known of these composers are Florence Price, who lived from 1887 to 1953, William Grant Still, who lived from 1895 to 1978, and William L. Dawson, who lived from 1899 to 1990. Again, sort of amazingly recently was this great generation of American symphonic composers still alive. And these names would have been familiar to American concertgoers in the 1930s. Their works were performed quite a bit. But interestingly, or perhaps predictably given the history of racism in the United States, their work had mostly fallen out of the repertoire until the last few years, in which we have seen a resurgence of interest in their work. And I actually find this to be one of the most exciting things happening in classical music these days. Thus, I want to end by observing how indebted we are to Jeanette Thurber. What she founded in 1885 planted seeds that we're still seeing bear fruit even today. American styles of composition, American performers who can trace their heritage back to students in her National Conservatory. Those are the end of my remarks for this evening. I really hope you enjoy what I think will prove to be a wonderful concert, and I want to thank you for your attention.
This production is co-produced by Northampton Open Media, your local public media. We provide resources to all voices in the community to create their own content. Membership is free, classes are free, equipment is free, but our existence is under threat. If you believe in what we do and want to keep us sustainable, do so on Patreon for as little as a few dollars a month. Look for Northampton Open Media on Patreon or go to our website at northamptonopenmedia.org.